Dear beloved community, I'm very honored to have the chance to sit on this panel with these three wonderful scientists, researchers, and I'm just going to take a moment to introduce the three of them to you before we hear their presentations, and then we'll also have some time at the end for some interaction. We hope they may ask each other some questions, and then maybe also have some time for questions from the audience. So on your left, we have Dr. Ruth Lanius, who's one of the leading researchers in the neuroscience of trauma and dissociation. And she's at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, which she wanted to remind us is not the 51st state of the US. And Ruth is a wonderful scientist, practitioner, human being. And we've had the honor of having her here in Plum Village before for a previous neuroscience retreat, and then again for an online science retreat, and I've even had the chance to co-teach with her a little bit online. So we've been getting to know each other for quite some time already. And it's going to be wonderful to hear from her this afternoon. The wonderful thing about this panel is that Ruth and Frank and Sebern all work together. And so this is a very deeply interconnected panel. And their talks will flow on from each other as well, I think, in a very beautiful way. So in the middle we have Dr. Frank Corrigan, who's a psychiatrist and one of the leading experts on the brainstem, and particularly how the brainstem affects the manifestations of trauma, and maybe and insights from the brainstem as to how we might go about alleviating the suffering of trauma. And then to my right we have Dr. Sebern Fisher, who's a pioneer of neurofeedback in the treatment of developmental trauma, particularly, and all kinds of trauma. And she's also a secret poet. You can ask her about that later.
This is all an in-joke.
And Sebern is actually having her 35th anniversary of being in Plum Village. So she's all of our ancestors. And she actually helped to build the Turtle Lodge, which is in the forest over there. And she came to a retreat here when they were with Thai, when there were probably retreats with like 20 people.
No, it was 100.
Oh, still 100 people. Okay. But so she's been here many, many times since, and is a member of the Order of Interbeing as well. So without further ado, I want to hand the mic to Ruth. Thank you.
It's a real privilege. It's a real privilege. How's this? Perfect. It's a real privilege to be in this wonderful community, and welcome to all. I want to talk a little bit about something that I think has been very difficult for my colleagues and me, and that's really observing the dehumanization of neuroscience, medicine, and mental health. And what do I mean by that? So I'm a psychiatrist and a researcher, and our group is very passionate about studying the brain underpinnings of post-traumatic stress and other trauma-related difficulties. And I think what we're observing is that what we're missing more and more out of the research is the actual first-person experience of suffering, which is really why we do this research. And also when we talk, to our patients who've been in the mental health care system, we hear about this desperation, not being able to receive help, but often when they get into the mental health care system, they feel like they've lost their dignity. And so, as we start today, I just want to have some thoughts about how we can humanize neuroscience, medicine, and mental health, or begin to think about humanizing it again. And I think one way out of this dehumanization is something that's called neurophenomenology. And this term was first coined by Francesco Varela, and I hear his wife is actually at the retreat. And I think what Francesco Varela taught us is that we can't understand the biological mechanisms without the first-person experience of suffering. So throughout neuroscience research, especially when we study different emotional difficulties, we always have to keep track of the first-person experience as well as what biological mechanisms we're studying. That may be brain imaging, that may be heart rate variability, that may be different inflammatory markers. So to always pair the two. And of course, I think this makes a lot of sense, but this I really experienced 25 years ago when I first started doing this research, when I saw a couple that was involved in a car accident. And this couple reacted completely different to the same accident. They were in the same car, same accident, and yet when they had the accident, their reactions were completely different. And that really taught me to go to Francesco Varela's work and combine the subjective experience with the biology that we were measuring. So I just want to quickly give you that case example to really illustrate the importance of that. So this couple was driving on a highway in Canada. They hit a thick wall of fog, slammed on the brakes. It became a several hundred car pileup within seconds. And a van was pushed into their car. A teenager tried to escape the car, and the couple witnessed the teenager burned to death. The husband then smashed in the windshield, pulled his wife out, and they were both saved. And then a month later, I had the opportunity to get to know them both, assess them, and scan their brain while they were recalling this car accident. And they both, were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. But when the husband recalled his accident, he was hyper-aroused, his heart rate increased, and he felt like he was back at the scene of the trauma, and he was planning how to pull himself and his wife out of the car. And his brain looked like this. So you see amygdala activation, that's part of the emotional learning brain. You see visual cortex activation, which likely reflected that he was having flashbacks, and some prefrontal cortex activity, which likely reflected him planning how to get himself and his wife out of the car. Now, his wife, who was in the passenger seat, same accident, same car, had a completely different response. She reacted like she did at the time of the car accident. She froze, she was in shock, she felt disconnected from her body, she was unable to move, and she said if it hadn't been for her husband, she wouldn't have been able to get out of the car. There was no increase in heart rate. And her brain looked like this. It was blank. And so this taught me immediately, whoa, right? People can have very different responses to trauma. And without really capturing the first-person experience in combination with the brain imaging, these results wouldn't have made very little sense. And so what does that teach us? Combining first-person experience with the neurobiology or whatever biological marker. I think it doesn't only bring in the suffering of an individual, but it makes our ability to understand brain, mind, and body much stronger, right? Because if we average these two scans, it wouldn't make any sense. And I think it also points to the importance of really looking at both qualitative and quantitative data. And I think this has been discussed earlier in the retreat, right? So we have very sophisticated analyses that can actually quantify the qualitative experience, the first-person experience, in addition to looking at the numbers and the brain networks, and then really bringing the two together. What are some additional problems that I think we're struggling in neuroscience and medicine and mental health? And that is that I think the brain-body disconnect is still alive and well, right? And when we think about our society as a whole, embodiment is something that we have a lot of difficulties with. And of course, this is something we try to capture here in these retreats. But what can help us to overcome this brain-body disconnect? Where do we need to look? What do we need to think about in neuroscience and medicine? What is one thing that we're missing? And I think one thing we're missing is what some brain researchers in a recent neuroscience review have called the fruit below the rind. And what they're referring to is the brainstem and cerebellum. The deepest part of the brain, some of us will call it the survival brain, that has profound influences on all other levels of the brain, but also on the body. And it's an area of the brain that we have largely ignored. A, because it's so difficult to study with imaging, and it's becoming easier, but it's been very difficult. But also, I think because we're human, and we're so impressed with ourselves and our cortex. And so I think we've often thought, oh, this primitive low thing, we don't have to worry about that. We'll stick, with the human part of the brain. And I think what's so critical about this lowest part of the brain, the brainstem and the midbrain, that it's really the intersection between the brain and body. And I think this can really help us to reunite brain, mind, and body. And in a recent review in Nature Neuroscience, they've also reminded us that, this has been left out of our understanding of cognitive neuroscience, and that really there's an urgent need to bring the whole brain and the body into the study of cognitive neuroscience. But we are really dedicating this afternoon to psychological trauma, right? Which is really somebody being under imminent threat all the time. And so here I think the brainstem and midbrain becomes even more important. Because as we know from research now is that as threat approaches us, and when threat is imminent, which is always the case in the aftermath of trauma, we see a shift in what happens in the brain. And so as threat becomes more imminent, it appears that the midbrain, specifically the periaqueductal gray, takes the driver's seat, and the cortex, the more human part of the brain, takes the back seat. Now, why is that? Our cortex is much slower and usually takes about 100 milliseconds to process information, whereas our brainstem can react within 16 milliseconds. And so when it's about survival, we have to react very quickly in order to increase our chance of survival. And often, relying on the cortex is not quick enough. And so I love this research by Mobbs, who has stated that imminent danger results in fast, likely hardwired defensive reactions mediated by the midbrain. And this is really about the brain adapting to inescapable threat and reacting very quickly to help us stay alive. So it's reacting without thinking. So now let's turn our attention to how we perceive threat versus safety. And of course, threat is at the core of trauma. And so when we think about how we experience threat or safety, it's really experienced through our senses, right? Senses that come in from the body and senses that come in through the environment. And just some gross basic anatomy, of course, the senses, the different sensory pathways from the body that really inform us about what's going on in the body, they enter at the level of the brainstem. And most external sensations, except for smell, again enter at the level of the midbrain, the superior colliculus. They first enter the brain. And so this is where the brain takes in sensations. And so this is also the first line of response. The brainstem has to make sense of these sensations at a brainstem level, at a preconscious level, and determine whether these sensations are safe or unsafe. And so what we're learning now, if at the level of the brainstem these sensations are determined to be unsafe, we stay at lower levels of the brain, in these subcortical loops. We react without thinking, because that's quick, and that increases our chance of survival. Whereas if those sensations are deemed as safe, they then flow to the level of the cortex, where they can profoundly affect all human functions, including embodiment, agency, connection, having a sense of the present, thinking and planning, emotion regulation, as well as curiosity. But when threat is always imminent, as it is in the aftermath of trauma, we stay at these lower subcortical loops that are quick, that help us to react without thinking in order to increase our survival. And so I think we can really see trauma as an insult to the senses, right? Again, we take in trauma through the senses. And then these sensations at the level of the brainstem couple with arousal and raw emotion. And Frank will talk about this in much more detail. And so the survival brain, the brainstem and midbrain is where these sensations, arousal, and raw emotion meet preconsciously and can start to deeply affect us without really knowing what is affecting us. And often this is trauma we experience pre-verbally, right? We're haunted by experiences, bodily experiences that we have no meaning for. And I think one explanation likely is that we're caught in these lower subcortical loops that don't fully connect or optimally connect to the cortex that allows us to make sense and make meaning. And so I want to take it a step further, and we've heard a lot in this retreat as the brain as a predictive organ, right? So we want to use these incoming sensations. That's what the brain needs in order to predict and update what's going to happen, right? And in a normal functioning brain, if I leave the meditation hall today and I trip, the next few times I'm leaving the meditation hall, my brain, my cortex is going to update, right? The sensory information of danger. And I'm going to be much more cautious, the next few times I leave the meditation hall. But after 3 or 4 times, when things have gone well, I skip out of the meditation hall, and my brain updates again that, okay, you're safe again. But this is not how trauma works, right? I think in trauma, what we see is that the brain has a real difficult time updating. Right? It can't update when we get safe information about the present. It has real difficulty updating and helping us know, okay, things are safe now. It's 2025. You're no longer being hurt. And so I want to share a recent study from our group that's going to be published in Nature Mental Health that I think really outlines that inability of the brain to predict. And the cerebellum, which is tightly connected to the midbrain and receives a lot of that sensory input, seems to be a hub that really prevents this updating and this predictive function of the brain in post-traumatic stress disorder. So I just want you to take a look at this image, and this is the brain functioning during recall of traumatic memory. So we're pushing the brain, we're stressing the brain. And I just want you to focus on that blue line. So blue means there is a lack of connectivity compared to non-traumatized, healthy individuals. And where we're seeing this blue line emerge from is predominantly from the cerebellum. So it doesn't get information to the higher levels of the brain, including the cortex and the thalamus. So the brain is not synchronized. And because the cerebellum is so important in this prediction and helping get sensory information to the cortex where the cortex can update, I think this is a huge problem in PTSD that leaves people, in these lower subcortical loops. What's happening at the same time is that we're also getting this hyperconnectivity, so too much connectivity in the cortex. But these two systems are functioning independently. And so we lose this capacity to update. Now, of course, this is something we want to bring back in treatment, right? And so we're extremely grateful to Frank Corrigan, who's developed deep brain reorienting, which is a treatment. I've been treating traumatized individuals for 25 years. That's really humbled me. And we have interim results from our deep brain reorienting study. And I'm just going to move over here. And I think there's a lot of hope here. And what you're seeing is the blue band, which is lack of connectivity. Now, when we're looking at individuals who have post-traumatic stress, when we compare them before and after treatment, during recall of traumatic memories, that connectivity comes back online. It's now red. And what that could really mean is that we're restoring the capacity of the brain to predict and to update to the present, to safety. And what we're seeing qualitatively in our subjects, who are really individuals who've been suffering for years and years, is that often it's the first time they're able to re-inhabit their body. And it's been really touching to observe that. And we're hoping to really combine these qualitative data with our neuroimaging data. But I think this provides incredible hope that we're starting to be able to reconnect the brain, I think, to restore this predictive capacity and allow the brain to update the information to the present. So what are the implications for therapy, right? We've been talking about the importance of the brainstem. That's where raw emotion, arousal, and these sensations, how we take in the world, meet. And a lot of our treatments really intervene at a cognitive level, right? So we're working with thoughts. And often our patients come in and they tell us, I know it was not my fault, right? So we've worked with the thoughts. But they say, but I can't stop feeling it. It keeps tearing me up inside. And we would hypothesize that this presentation is exactly where the brainstem is still very much affected, and we haven't gotten to the foundation of the trauma response, which we would hypothesize is deep within the brainstem and midbrain. And this takes us into the next two parts of this talk, which are really about targeting directly deep brain circuits. And a number of body-oriented treatments can do this. Neurofeedback, we've shown, can get at this deep brain level. And of course, Sebern has devoted her career to neurofeedback and how that can help shift, some of the major brain networks. And now we have Frank's deep brain reorienting, which is a psychotherapy he'll explain in detail that targets directly these deep brain circuits. And so by targeting these deep brain circuits, we're really intervening in a bottom-up way, right? We're going to the root of the problem, and by really targeting the root at this deep level of the brain can reorganize from bottom up and again, then top down. And it can also have a profound effect on the body. But I think a lot of us are still confused about, what bottom-up treatment really is. And I think Frank has really beautifully described that. So I'm just going to go through some thoughts about what bottom-up treatment really is and then turn it over to Frank. The more we try to do bottom-up therapy, the more we risk disrupting its natural unfolding. What is called for is not technique, but attunement, a kind of felt listening that lets something emerge in its own time, on its own terms, before interpretation, before knowing. And with that in mind, we're going to go deep into the brain at a preconscious level before interpretation, before knowing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth. This is very, it feels very hopeful. It feels like there's something new in the world of, how to address these deeply stuck patterns of traumatic remembering or, traumatic stress. So let us enjoy the sound of the bell. We can also be feeling our bodies, feeling our nervous systems, letting everything we've heard settle.
Just check the sound first of all. Am I audible at the back? I hope understandable too, even with my pronounced accent. So it's just first of all like to say that it is a great honour to be here, great privilege to be here. So I'm very grateful for the invitation to be here to present today, even in this heat. So I'm a general psychiatrist, and for many years worked in a national health service in Scotland, and over many years was preoccupied with the question of why early life adversity would lead to an increase in suicidality. And many people did not complete the suicide, but lived with a constant desire to be dead or an impulse to be dead. And it always seemed to me that the most severe suicidality was associated with the most severe abuse or neglect in early life. So my approach, I trained in many different trauma therapy models, trying to understand. Yeah. All right. Okay, good. Okay, yeah. How is that now? Yeah, good, thank you. That's a little easier too. Yeah, good. So I was curious about this link between early life adversity and later suicidality. And the research literature did not really give ideas on the associations. So my way of approaching it with all the different trauma therapy modalities was trying to understand everything that came from the patients that I was treating in terms of brain functioning and brain dysfunctioning. So it meant that I didn't have scanners to be able to check out the theories as I do now, thanks to Ruth and her team, but could get a sense of whether theories and hypotheses were valid or not from a clinical perspective. And many of them I had to discard as rubbish. But just kept working, trying to understand the link between the early trauma and the later life distress, especially when it involved an increase in suicidality. So the end result, after working with many different modalities, was developing deep brain reorienting, and this met some criteria that I had for an effective treatment, because it could be used in the most severely distressed patients. Other modalities were often effective but didn't work in the most severely distressed, or couldn't be used without an extensive period of stabilization. So this formed a way to work with even the most severely distressed. And if there's a way of working with the trauma history, then there's hope for the future. Even a minimal change can imply the possibility of further change, and therefore the possibility of healing over time. So it may take years, but at least there's a way of moving forward session by session to get to the healing of the deepest wounding that had occurred in very early life. The first draft of slides for today was rejected by Sebern, who said it was far too clinical, and so I hope that this draft is more suited to this audience, because the focus is on suffering, the reasons for suffering, and the pathway to healing from suffering. And in brainstem terms, we're looking at what activates, what intensifies experiences, what makes traumatic experiences traumatic. And I think that what we are finding is that the brainstem arousal, the shock, the horror, intensifies the emotional response, and also can intensify the memories, so that people remember in flashbacks the horrors that have occurred to them. And now I think that those flashbacks are there because at the inception of the memory, there was a high level of shock. And this level of shock was in the brainstem. And if we're going to clear the clinical syndrome, we need to get back to the shock right at the beginning of the traumatic experience. And often that's out of awareness, especially if it's from very early life, if it's from early neglect, abandonment in infancy, traumas in the early neonatal period. We've got no episodic memory of these things. And early attachment wounding, we're going in through present day activating stimuli to find ways to get into what's been stored in the brainstem that's causing continuing pain and distress. And I've always been impressed by the healing capacity of humans, and I think it's important in doing trauma therapy that we do not think of the trauma therapist doing something to the client that gets the client better, because we're trying to liberate a healing process that's intrinsic to the human condition but has got blocked in some way. And to help to be in that healing process, it's important for the therapist to be present, to be here now when with the patient, to be attentive at the deep emotional level rather than working at the upper level, at the cognitive meaning-making level. So we're doing our best to get into this deep brain for the reorienting there. One of the beneficial things that's come from the development of DBR is the idea of locating the where self. And this idea came mainly from a book by Greg Frishon, who described brain systems for us knowing where we are in this moment, and brain systems for what we are encountering. And of course, the brain systems for where and what readily come together, but trauma memories are about what has happened. So we look to find a way to separate out the sense of whereness and nowness from what has happened. And that's given us this idea of locating the where self as a way of being here now without intrusion of thoughts and images and memories and so on. And for where self location, we do not mention relaxation, we do not mention calmness, we don't use breathing. We're focused purely on here, now. The sense of gravity holding you in your chair, just notice what it's like that you don't float off to the ceiling. You can sense the direction of gravity, the up and down line. Everyone, I think, unless they're in orbit around the Earth, is going to have that capacity for the sensing into the direction of gravity, and we can use that for the sense of being here now. We can also use the axes of orienting of the body, the head to tail axis of the spine, the side to side, the upper and lower, the front to back. But the key thing is to find ways that suit the individual of getting into this sense of the body, how it's present, how it's balanced, how it's positioned in this moment now. And in DBR, once we have the orienting tension, then we're looking for, once we have the where self, then we're looking for the orienting tension. This is something that comes in to the forehead, the muscles around the eyes, or the muscles at the base of the skull, momentarily before any traumatic response. And I think it works well as an anchor for processing, because it's there in the forehead, around the eyes, or the base of the skull before any trauma response. And the next response is the shock that I'll expand on, and then the affect, the basic emotional response. So this is our key sequence, the separating out of the shock after the activating stimulus and after we obtain the orienting tension from the affect that follows. When I was trying to find papers of relevance to mindfulness practitioners, I happened across this paper, which is really useful, so I'm glad that I was stimulated to search for it, because this paper brings together details of the speed of the response. You can see that in the first 20 milliseconds after a stimulus, we can have a response from the superior colliculus. That gives us our orienting tension. Then we get the activation of the locus coeruleus, which gives us our shock. And then the cortex comes online at some point for conscious awareness, but also the periaqueductal gray for the basic emotional response. So just to show where we are in brainstem terms, you can see the three areas of the brainstem: the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. And right at the top of the midbrain is the area of the superior colliculus. This is from where we orient to stimuli such as sounds or visual stimuli. This is from where we get the orienting tension before any trauma response. And you can see that the layers of the colliculi that take in the information about the stimuli are adjacent to the columns of the periaqueductal gray, from where we get our basic affective and defensive responses. So shock is happening within, I think, 50 milliseconds, which may be why there hasn't been much focus on it before now. And if we look at this in millisecond terms, we can see that shock coming in within 50 milliseconds, let's say, with the activation of the locus coeruleus. Then we get the activation of the periaqueductal gray for the affective and defensive responses. And then we get the peripheral autonomic nervous system changes. And many trauma models have focused on the peripheral autonomic nervous system change, and we are saying that's too late. All that's happening critical to the clinical syndrome that follows is happening potentially in those first 50 milliseconds. And I'm hoping that one of these days there'll be a study of the use of DBR in acute situations like war zones, because what I've seen working with people in war zones is that if the day before the session they've been bombed, their neighbours have been killed, even the day after, if we're using DBR, we can get a reduction of the shock of the events, and I hope that reduces the risk of long-term PTSD, and I hope that'll be studied. So the shock manifests often with nothing visible on the surface, but we slow down enough to ask about it. Is there a shiver, a shudder, a jolt, a gasp, a blow to the chest or the abdomen? These fleeting sensations are what we slow down enough to pick up before the emotional or the defensive responses come in. And we think that that's important for the later development of PTSD, but also of syndromes of chronic derealization, depersonalization, hypervigilance to threat, sleep disturbances, and intense affective responses. And shock in early life, shock in an early attachment relationship, the shock in the infant who reaches out to the mother and from whom the mother pulls away. That kind of shock, we argue, has a long-term effect at the brainstem level and a long-term effect on the activations then at the upper levels of the brain. So the locus coeruleus has got this capacity to produce activation throughout the brain, and it can also contribute to emotional memories and traumatic memories. And when we pick up the shock, we urge people to be with it, to slow down, to just be in this moment with those shock sensations. Let us be together with them, holding them and letting it process. So when I was coming here, I thought, if shock isn't in Buddhist psychology, does it mean that I have to say to a group of Buddhists that they need to slow down more? That they need to be more mindful? But I thought there must be another explanation, and I'm so relieved here. I know you're a non-violent audience, but nevertheless, it's a relief to find that there is an alternative explanation. Long-term meditation alters the basic functioning of the locus coeruleus, so that I think that long-term meditators are more able to be with a prefrontal cortex awareness of the abstract and an enhanced sensory awareness in the same moment. And perhaps that leads to shock proofing, shock resistance to some extent. But I do hope that anyone who is using this model, who learns this model, applies some of the principles of slowing down and being, just being with. And after the shock dissipates, then we get the pain, and it's often the pain of aloneness, abandonment, rejection, humiliation, betrayal, injustice. If people have difficulties with emotions like sadness or rage or shame or fear, the likelihood is that there's unprocessed shock and pain underneath. So we look to get back to process what's underneath. I use this idea of the compass of pain to illustrate that point, that if there's a lot of pain inside, the emotional responses are intensified by the shock and the emotional pain inside. And Anna Hallberg pointed me to the big bell and some writings there, which I thought were lovely, and so I just wanted to quote, because this is what I think is needed for the DBR therapist. We will sit and listen in order to understand. We will sit and listen so attentively that we will be able to hear what the other person is saying and also what is being left unsaid. We know that just by listening deeply, we already alleviate a great deal of pain and suffering in the other person. And we argue that when we've made it a really specific experience, once we've identified this sequence, when we've got to underlying shock and pain that are really specific, then that being with allows the healing at the deepest level. Aloneness is not good for us, it seems, and a paper in Nature last month, admittedly on rats rather than humans, did show that there are neurons in the hypothalamus that respond to isolation and neurons that respond to reunion. So we think that when people have experienced intense isolation and are then again in communication, it's working potentially at the hypothalamic level, where there is this need in an area that's also associated with hunger and thirst and temperature control. So we, in Deep Brain Reorienting, are turning towards pain that has been intolerable. If it's a pain from a neglected infant, the pain feels unbearable. It feels never-ending. It feels that it will never change, that there is no possibility of healing. And we don't try to do anything but to be with it, to allow a turning towards it that allows a relief of this pain and a healing from the being with and the orienting towards it. And even when it takes a long time, if we can get into the origins of the shock and horror and pain and identify them and turn towards them and be with them, we're demonstrating the origins of the suffering, and we're demonstrating the capacity to turn towards it, to be with it, and to allow the healing of, I think, even the deepest pain and distress. And that, for me, gives hope that even when people have suffered what to me seem like unbearable, horrific traumas, that there is a way that we can help. There is something we can offer and as part of a path to healing. Thank you for bearing with me and my accent in this intense heat.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Frank, for this wonderful presentation, which flowed on so beautifully from Ruth's. I think many people will have already been noticing some of the connections to the type of practice but also the way of practice here in Plum Village. And what really struck me was how sometimes when we do the group sharing practice, which is really a listening practice, primarily what we are trying to, well, I don't know about everybody else, but usually when I guide people in deep listening, I've kind of instinctively gravitated towards inviting people not to be thinking about the words that they're hearing, but to be in this mode of feeling what they're feeling as they are hearing what's being said. And that, so for the therapist to sort of stay at the felt sensory level, not at the level of meaning making, that really struck me in what you were saying, and also just that, you know, the methodology that Thai offered us is a community methodology. Everything is based for us on being together, and that itself being an experience of healing. So yeah, it's wonderful to hear echoes of that in what you shared, and I look forward to maybe after Sebern's sharing we can also have opportunities to reflect more on that and other things. Thank you so much, Frank. Let's once again let go of the meaning making and thinking and theory making part of our brain and just come back to the sensing and feeling the vibrations of the sound of the bell.
There's a whole new meaning to meltdown. Thank you. I want to dedicate my talk to Thai, my teacher, and to all of us who are traumatized people. I hope you're beginning to understand how amazing you are, that you have lived with these brains and are thriving yet. Okay. If you were to get an email from me, thank you. It's a better way to do it. If you were going to get an email from me, the tagline would always be a quote from Tesla, Nikola Tesla. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And that's what I think, that's where I've come to in understanding a lot of what's going on in the brain. I do neurofeedback primarily, although I'm now very engaged with DBR because it's an extraordinary therapy. And what Frank was suggesting in this is that shock is the core component, where it's easy to think of shock and frequency together, right? If you put your finger in a socket, which I somehow did often as a child, I don't know how that happened, but so I have the experience of shock of that order too. You understand that the frequency of shock would reorder the frequency domain of the brain. And so it is with Frank is discovering neurofeedback, I'm discovering DBR, and Ruth is researching the whole package. And we're bringing it here within the context, at least for me, of a deep Buddhist practice. So in 1990, I came here, and we had a tea. There were 30 of us in one of the buildings I probably don't even recognize anymore which one. We had a tea with Thai, and we all drank tea, and I think the only one who was really drinking tea was Thai. I think the rest of us were performing drinking tea, because it's nerve-wracking. It was nerve-wracking. So, and he then asked everybody to say why it was that they had come. And people had profound stories. People had come from other monastic traditions. They had had severe loss. They had, the stories that we hear, the human stories. And it got to me, and I said, well, I don't have a story. What happened is that a patient of mine brought in a magazine called Common Boundary, which was a magazine devoted to the boundary that connected psychotherapy and spirituality. Unfortunately, that magazine is no longer in print. But there was an article in there by Thich Nhat Hanh about psychotherapy, and it was fine, but that wasn't what brought me to Plum Village. It was the photograph of Thai. And I told him this, and I felt like I had a very uninspired reason for being there. But, and we went around, and at the end we had breakfast, and then Thai started his Dharma talk. And what he said was, nobody came to the Buddha for his teaching. They came to the Buddha for his presence. And you see how it ties in with what is already being talked about, right? The presence, the importance of presence to each other. This was a retreat on Buddhist psychology. It took me 10 days to recognize that that's what he was teaching. So I didn't understand. The very first Dharma talk we had here, Willingham, was about Buddhist psychology. And we would be friends of mine, and I would wander around, new friends, and we'd say, well, this is powerful. To some of us, it felt kind of like an acid trip. And we'd be walking around and saying, all of this is profound. The only part that can't be true is this no-self thing. That just can't be, right? That was inconceivable. So the whole point, maybe the whole point of Buddhist psychology is to underpin the possibility, the reality of no self. But that was what we found completely impossible. I left the retreat saying that I would be practicing breathing for the next year, thinking that I was making a huge commitment. And I won't surprise any of you to know that I'm still practicing breathing 35 years later, and I still benefit from it. The only time I don't benefit from it is when I do DBR, right? It's just got a different mechanism of action, and that's the thing that I think that Phap Linh and Frank will explore together about how, because to get to the brainstem, you have to do you've got to allow something that breathing in a particular way doesn't allow. When I went home, I entered a very deep psychotherapy, and I came here as a trauma therapist, and I entered this deep therapy to discover that I was a traumatized person, and that trauma was pretty severe, and that I also suffered a different kind of no self. And I'm going to show you what this means. That's showing up? Yeah, okay. So that's the default mode network in a non-traumatized brain. This is the network in the human brain that allows, it's sort of the infrastructure of the sense of self and the sense of other. In people who are deeply traumatized, this is what this is what you see instead. This is the, there's no communication, there's no blood flow. That's oxygen and blood flow that you're seeing on the top slide. And when Ruth, this is Ruth's work, and when she first showed us this slide, I thought it was the single most profound slide I'd ever seen. And I started to understand myself, even though I didn't have a self yet to truly understand. Okay. All right, so I was in this profound therapy. I was inhabiting the form of meditation, which I have to say was the only meditation I could do. I was not good at it, and I wasn't making a whole lot of progress in psychotherapy either, although my therapist I thought was fabulous and still do. And a fellow yogi had me out for dinner and told me about this thing called neurofeedback, which I was incredibly skeptical about. And I'll say the other thing I was incredibly skeptical about was when Ruth told me about DBR. And I said, no, that can't be. The only way you can get to a brain is through neurofeedback. But I had initially been very skeptical at neurofeedback too. So neurofeedback, just in a, I just want to sort of highlight the main principles that I want you to pay attention to because they have something to do with frequency. The brain organizes itself in frequencies, okay? So you can, so this is actually my granddaughter, Emily, in her pajamas, looking at a neurofeedback screen. And what she's got sensors on her head that are picking up the brain waves. They're amplified and picking up the brain waves, and she can watch her brain waves scrolling, and she can learn by a system of reward, simple reward, to change the way her brain fires, to change the frequencies of her brain. So when for most people with early childhood trauma, it is quieting the nervous system. It's calming the nervous system that is required. It's helping the nervous system regulate itself because there haven't been adequate parenting to help this child learn to regulate herself. It's not true of my granddaughter, thankfully. So you can change which frequencies are most influential in the brain. We can do this with very simple feedback. This is sitting in front of a computer and watching your brain making brainwaves. When you do, even a brain like the one that has no default mode network can develop a default mode network. It's a frequency band. It's a band of frequencies. It's a functional connectivity. And it can learn to regulate itself. And when it does, when the regulation starts to take hold, the default mode network forms. And then you develop a sense of self. I have to say that as a psychotherapist, I was very much engaged, not at the brain level. I knew nothing about the brain. This was all mind to me. And I was thinking, you know, what we needed to do was to help people develop a secure sense of self and an ego. And then, so it was a good ego structure. Well, I just finished my graduate degree, paying off my graduate debt, and Buddhism starts coming into my life, where they're talking about no self and no ego. This was challenging. So these are the fundamental brainwaves, just so you get to see them. And all you do is you say, okay, you put into the computer, oh, I want this brain to make more alpha waves, and the person will be rewarded when they make more alpha waves. Everybody right now, it's hard to believe in this heat, but you're all making all of these waveforms all the time. When you're rewarded to make a particular bandwidth, you'll make more of that. And there's a state attached to all of those bandwidths that then you will start to inhabit that state, or that possibility for state. So this is, quote, normal is a word we shouldn't use, but this is an unaffected EEG. I don't know how to get around normal. And so that's a well-functioning signal. And this is the signal of a typical trauma survivor. They have to get to that. And so there's a series of inhibits and a series of rewards that allows the brain to move increasingly toward its own regulation and toward this kind of signature. So, okay, so this is also work by Ruth, and this is the brainstem's influence. This is pre and post one session of neurofeedback. The pre is the top, and these are all severely traumatized people. And what you see with this red line at the bottom of the top slide is the PAG, the periaqueductal gray that Frank was talking about, and Ruth too, that is calling the shots for the cortex. It's actually going to the amygdala and it's activating this person. There's very little cortical involvement. After one session of neurofeedback, this whole, for 80% of people in this study, this whole thing changes, and the cortex is now calling the shots over the brainstem. And what you've seen is a developmental course that takes typically 25 years for the prefrontal cortex to be in control of the more primitive parts of the brain. I presented this in South Africa, and my granddaughter told me that the data was actually that women developed this control in the prefrontal cortex at 23 and men at 25. So I just wanted you to know that was the case. Okay. Okay, so at some point along the way, So I was invited to Ruth invited me to come and meet this person named Frank Corrigan, and who had this fabulous new therapy called deep brain reorienting, and I said politely, no. There's all these people interested in the brain, and they don't know how to reach the brain, and I don't buy any of it, and so I didn't go. And as you're learning, the more I'm skeptical of something, the more you should look at it, okay? All right. And now we are working, I've been experiencing DBR with Frank, and it's been a most illuminating, sometimes most challenging process. But we're called upon to bring all of this together, as I mentioned earlier. And I think what shock does in the frequency domain of the brain is that it just amplifies everything. That's really what Frank was saying. But if you just think about this as frequencies, it just makes sense, right? It just makes sense that if you had shock, that shock would be the inciting moment. It's shock that will create the tsunami. So, what was happening when I was here, which I was doing with very little awareness, actually, at the time, but I was beginning my search for self and for no self. And I'm going to end my talk. Aren't you grateful to hear those words? Okay, I'm going to end my talk with, I want to read a journal entry, a couple of journal entries actually from a retreat at the Forest Refuge in Massachusetts. And and then end with a piece that was first read to me by my Dharma teacher there, Jill Shepard. Okay, so it's very hot. Just float. Don't think too hard about this. Just let it, let it. The seeds. The less your mind is actually engaged, the more the seeds are watered. So, the sweat is watering seeds too. Think of it that way. Okay, I will. Okay. I felt quite centered as I headed out along the uneven path into the woods. Something is changing. This is actually, just so you know where I am, this is in 2023. I've had a year of DBR, and I'm thinking about all these practices of psychotherapy, the practice of neurofeedback, the practice of meditation, and the practice of DBR. I felt quite centered as I headed out along the uneven path into the woods. Something is changing. The trauma experience is dematerializing. Substance is draining out. I do not identify with it, and my identity is no longer of it. I experience not just absence of trauma, but in Buddhist terms, emptiness of self. I was wondering what this would mean for DBR when my foot caught on some roots and I fell. No damage done, but of course it got my attention, as hitting the ground will do. My history will affect me even if I no longer identify with it. Even as the impact of the stories disappear, vibrations remain. The Buddha would have no language for frequency, but I think it's key to everything he taught. We are frequency. In DBR, it is shock. It's shock waves that overtake and overwhelm the frequencies of the brain. The brain organizes itself in these frequency patterns. It communicates to itself that way. It learns and holds what it learns in patterns of vibration. This whole Buddhist experiment devotes itself to knowing no self, to letting the ego go. What is the ego but the oscillation of fear? That's actually a thought that first came to me with Robert Thurman, who's a Buddhist teacher. What is left when all of this truly drops away? Oscillation, bare vibration, unadorned. But for all too many, that domain is shot through with shock. That is what I think I experienced today. That's what this all means. For DBR. I could only reach these levels with brainwave training and DBR that helps me know the reality of shock and to begin to dissolve it. And I left this retreat, and you'll hear why, and this is just a letter to my teacher afterwards, commenting on it. I left because I had to stop meditating. I was going so deep in my sitting meditations, discovering no mind at all, but then suddenly there would be a trauma intrusion, and I just don't have the skill yet to manage this. The meditation legend, as I've always heard it, is that these states of breakthrough to the reality of no self obviate the terrible realities of the conditioned self. At the very least, that one wouldn't have to experience them simultaneously. I'm not complaining, it was extraordinary, but given the present instability of my CNS, not really manageable. But it actually may have been the instability that made it all possible. I don't know. My mind was amenable to sitting. It was my brain saying, no, enough for now. And I will know when to start again. So I was home and still not meditating. And if it's premature, I can train. Over time, during the retreat, the question came, What in the cosmos is irreducible? The answer is vibration. In our individual universe, when the brain learns to change the frequencies at which it vibrates, agitation can diminish, attention can improve, all kinds of things can change. Autoimmune disorders, migraine headache, the sense of self itself. That's what we're seeing. This happens most readily with neurofeedback. There is feedback to the brain, but of course it can happen with meditation as well. We are negotiating this whole Buddhist project through the frequencies of our brain and body, but these frequencies remain after death. They cannot be buried, they cannot be burned, they cannot disappear. We may each have our own little individual frequency imprint in the vast cosmos of vibration that changes things in infinitesimal but significant ways, because it would have to, and that might even reconstitute in another frequency being that we might call rebirth. I am beginning to say boldly, I think, that the mind is infinite, but fully and deeply respecting its complexity, the brain is not. Our treatments, neurofeedback and DBR, focus on the brain. These practices address regulation and the multiple shocks that dysregulate, and have given me a new and evolving mind. Psychotherapy gives me invaluable time and attention for the mind that is emerging. And now I think, because the brainstem is quieting, my mind is learning for a few moments at a time to dissolve itself into pure vibration. So I just want to switch and read you this beautiful piece that was read to me at on one of my retreats at the Forest Refuge. This is called The Silent Pulse. It's a book by George Leonard. The subtitle is A Search for the Perfect Rhythm That Exists in Each of Us. And this is, I thought, particularly useful because this is his thoughts on quantum physics. Okay. Almost done, everyone. Okay. The electron scanning microscope, with the power to magnify several thousand times, takes us down into a realm that has the look of the sea about it. In the kingdom of the corpuscles, no, that's right, never mind. There is transfiguration and there is samsara, the endless round of birth and death. Every passing second, some 2.5 million red cells are born. Every second, the same number die. The typical cell lives about 110 days, then becomes tired and decrepit. There are no lingering deaths here, for when a cell loses its vital force, it somehow attracts the attention of the macrophage. As the magnification increases, the flesh does begin to dissolve. Muscle fiber now takes on a fully crystalline aspect. We can see that it is made of long spiral molecules in orderly array. And all of these molecules are swaying like wheat in the wind, connected with one another and held in place by invisible waves that pulse many trillion times a second. vibration, right? What are the molecules made of? As we move closer, we see atoms, the tiny shadowy balls dancing around their fixed locations in the molecules, sometimes changing position with their partners in perfect rhythms. And now we focus on one of the atoms. Its interior is lightly veiled by a cloud of electrons. We come closer, increasing the magnification. The shell dissolves, and we look on the inside to find nothing. Somewhere within that emptiness, we know is a nucleus. We scan the space, and there it is, a tiny dot. At last, we have discovered something hard and solid, a reference point. But no. As we move closer to the nucleus, it too begins to dissolve. It too is nothing more than an oscillating field, waves of rhythm. Inside the nucleus are other organized fields, protons, neutrons, even smaller particles. Each of these, upon our approach, also dissolve into pure rhythm. These days, they, the scientists, he wrote this, not me. These days, they, the scientists, are looking for quarks, strange subatomic entities having qualities which they describe with such words as upness, downness, charm, strangeness, truth, beauty, color, and flavor. But no matter. If we could get close enough to these wondrous quarks, they too would melt away. They too would have to give up all pretense of solidity. Even their speed and relationship would be unclear, leaving them only relationship and pattern of vibration. Of what is the body made? It is made of emptiness and rhythm. Thank you.